recording going. So today we're looking at the end of chapter 2, at the end of our basic exercise science. We're going to kind of finish up talking about the kinetic chain today. And after we understand that, we can understand again a little bit better about how the human body sort of operates. So after this presentation, our objectives today are to understand the basic structure and function of both the muscular and the endocrine systems. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how those systems are sort of responding or adapting to the different types of stress that we might be putting on them. So looking at our muscular system here, we talked about how the kinetic chain is, these three interdependent systems, right? You've got your nervous system, which is sort of the command center that's kind of controlling everything. You have got your skeletal system, which is giving you the framework. And then you've got your muscular system, which moves that framework around, right? So, if we are defining this, right, it's a series of muscles that are under the control of your nervous system, and they're designed to generate internal tension in order to manipulate your skeletal system. So what your muscles are is they're basically these big, bundles of cells. And those cells are able to kind of contract themselves. They're able to shorten down. And if that happens in this cell and that one and that one and that one, and it happens in all of these cells simultaneously, all of them kind of, move, shorten themselves like this and kind of bunch up. What that does is that drags the muscle. And if it's attached to a bone, it's going to drag the bone and manipulate it and move it around. So that's sort of the arrangement here, right? And it's all under the control of nerves. There are going to be nerves that come down and they insert onto your muscle's belly. And then that is going to send a signal, which will trigger that contraction to happen, and it'll drag that bone around. And so they are generating their own tension internally, and that manipulates our skeletal system to move it around. So when we look at a muscle overall, we have to look at all of the different little layers of it, because we kind of want to understand that your muscles really are like a series of bundles all together. So if we look at muscle fibers, actually that's not really what I want to look at. Let's see here, muscle. Let's just do it this way. We'll do fascicle arrangement. That might work. No, anatomy of a muscle. Come on, help me out, Google. Read my brain. There we go. All right, so if we take a look at what a muscle actually looks like, we can see it's a series of fibers all bundled together, right? So what we're seeing right here, this right here, this big tube with this little tiny tube sticking out of it right here. This big tube is actually an individual muscle cell. So that is an individual muscle fiber is what we call it. It gets kind of a special name. We call it a muscle fiber just because it sort of indicates that it has a lot of special little structures inside of it. And muscle cells do have a lot of special little structures inside of them. So this is our muscle fiber or our muscle cell. And you'll notice, like I said, it's got all the normal features that you'd find inside of a cell. You get nucleuses here. You can see here's the mitochondria that's giving it its cell or its energy. Capillaries, the little blood flow that's kind of running throughout the whole thing to supply the muscle fiber with oxygen and nutrients and things like that. But you'll also notice all these little dots right here, which are these little tubes that we're seeing here. These are what we call a myofibril. And myofibrils are these little these big long rods that have little tiny proteins that live on them. Now, what's crazy is we could actually zoom in even further. And if you look at this myofibril, you'll notice it has a whole bunch of little dots on it, and it has these kind of little lines on it. So when we look at a myofibril, you'll actually see it is sort of straddled with all these little proteins. And that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at how these proteins that kind of look like this, you can kind of see like these little proteins here. And they are actually what's contracting. They're actually what's drawing inward. So what happens is those proteins draw towards their center, and that shortens the myofibril. And because the myofibril is tied from end to end on the muscle fiber here, the muscle cell, the entire muscle cell shortens. And then you'll notice that if we look at our muscles here, they are arranged in such a way that like this fiber is tied together with this fiber, which is tied together with this fiber, and that one, and that one, and that one, right? There's a whole bunch of muscle fibers. So as all of those other muscle fibers are shortening their myofibrils, right? This entire bundle here, this bigger bundle, shortens. And this bigger bundle right here is what we call a fascicle. A fascicle is basically a bundling of individual muscle cells. So we got a big muscle cell here, and then we got a whole bunch of muscle cells come together, and that makes up a fascicle. And then another bundling, you can see here's a fascicle and another fascicle and another fascicle. And those are all tied together to make up the overall muscle itself. So your muscle is made up of fascicles. Fascicles are made up of muscle cells. Muscle cells are made up of all the normal cell materials plus a whole bunch of myofibrils, right? So bundles of bundles of bundles. You wouldn't think that it would be, so many layers here, but it actually is. When you look at kind of like if you take like a chicken breast and you just kind of peel it apart, you'll see all these individual little bits. What you're seeing are all the fascicles, and if you were to zoom in even further, eventually you'd be able to see individual muscle cells. And if you zoomed in even further, eventually you'd be able to see the myofibrils there. So that's what we're seeing here. So if we're labeling these out and we're understanding our first layers, right? The first bundle is the actual muscle itself, right? So the actual muscle itself is a series of fascicles all bundled together. And so it has this outermost layer that we call the epimysium. So you can actually see that right here. This outermost layer right here, this is your epimysium, okay? And it sort of like surrounds the entire, you can see they're kind of actually peeling it back here. Your epimysium is sort of acting as like fascia. It's actually acting to make sure that like none of these bundles ever end up like, getting kind of intertwined with one another, right? Because they are contracting and relaxing, which means they're kind of, going to kind of bulge out and stuff. So our fascia is going to make sure that number one, your muscle fibers don't get out of arrangement. And number two, it's going to ensure that it doesn't get stuck to any other materials inside your body. So it's not going to end up like, sticking to a bone or some other type of tissue inside the body. So that's the outermost layer. That's your epimysium here. And then the fascicle itself is going to have a wrapper around it. And that wrapper is going to be called, that's your next layer. That's going to be called your paramecium. And so your paramecium is around the perimeter of a fascicle, right? And so the paramecium sort of wraps around the fascicle. Again, same purpose here. It's going to keep these cells from not sort of getting out of arrangement and getting intertwined or tangled up or anything like that. And then you've got your individual muscle fiber here, your muscle cell, which again, like I said earlier, has all of the normal features that you are going to see inside of an animal cell. One of those features is that it has a plasma membrane. It has a cell wall, right? And so the wall around the outside of this gets sort of a special name. We are going to call that your endomysium. So we're looking at the word origins here. We're looking at like mesium, right? That's anytime you see the word like myo or sarco or anything like that, with my, you're in muscle territory. We're talking about muscles. And then we've got epi, which is around the epicenter. So that's actually surrounding the area. Peri, which means it's around the perimeter. And endo, which means innermost. So each of those layers has like different amounts of connective tissue. And this doesn't seem like it'd be a very important concept to talk about, but the thing is, connective tissue actually does explain a little bit of our muscular hypertrophy. muscle growth, right? So when we think about like growing our muscles, we kind of just talked about this. This is for those of you who were in our last course. We just talked about this the other day. We talked about the difference between like myofibril and sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, right? When we grow our our muscles, right? They kind of grow in one of two ways. We either increase the fluid in the cell, which makes the cells more puffy, which makes them larger and then they look bigger, or we increase the proteins inside, which actually results in like a larger cell because you've got more of those myofibrils, right? So we can see here more myofibrils, and here we can see just larger cells with more fluid. Both those are going to result in like larger muscles, right? But this is going to be a very, very, very strong muscle because it actually has more proteins. This is just simply going to be a big muscle that probably is relatively strong. Don't get me wrong, but it's probably not going to be as strong as something that actually has more proteins in it. So that's how we experience hypertrophy, but we are also going to see, I don't know if I'm going to get a picture of this, connective tissue hypertrophy. Maybe? Yeah, probably not. We are also going, I don't know if I'm going to get like the type of picture I want. So we are actually going to see that our connective tissue actually gets a little bit larger as well by making, this is sort of tied to our sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. When you puff up your muscles with like more water and stuff, that actually changes the shape of the connective tissue between these layers. Actually, there's kind of a good example. You can kind of see there's all the individual layers there. So if we were to like have more layers and more connective tissue in there, that's going to result in larger muscles. So how do we do that? Well, actually kind of the same way as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. We're actually going to achieve stuff like that by doing sort of a moderate duration of reps with a moderate intensity. We want to sort of be straddling the line between, that needs to go on mute. We need to be straddling the line between high reps and low reps, and straddling the line between like high rest and low rest. If your goal is to kind of grow your muscles, right? Again, looking at our muscle bundling here, you can see we've got a muscle, which is nothing more than a bundle of fascicles. Then we got our fascicles. That's nothing more than a bundle of individual muscle fibers. And then a muscle fibers is a muscle fiber, or a muscle cell, is a series of actin and myosin proteins, which are the proteins we're going to be talking about in just a little bit here. So that is sort of what we are going to see when we're looking at our overall muscular system. Now, like I said, there is a lot of connective tissue in there in the form of like fascia, but sort of the main connective tissue that we kind of spend our time talking about are our tendons. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with this slide. You will recognize this picture from yesterday. Here is a ligament that is attaching the femur to the fibula, right? So that's a ligament. It's a white piece of connective tissue that attaches this bone to this bone, right? Well, we also have this white connective tissue here, which is attaching this quadriceps muscle to this bone. So, and then we see like there is also some like white connective tissue here, right? Look at all that fascia. That is a tendon. So the difference between like ligaments and tendons is that a ligament attaches bones to bones and a tendon attaches a muscle to a bone. They both share some interesting characteristics. They both don't get as much blood flow as other types of tissue do. Actually, you know what? I don't even need to do that. There's a tendon picture right here. So you can see here's a tendon, right? This muscle sort of, all comes together and it ends in this tendon that inserts on a bone there. So all of your muscles are attached to your skeleton in various different types of tendons. And some of them are more like fascial than others. Like for instance, if you take a look right here, you at this sort of overall picture of the body. Look at how much like white connective tissue is on the top of your skull. We don't actually have a lot of muscles up here, but we do have muscles sort of in our forehead and stuff. And, when you're moving them around and doing all this kind of stuff, right? Like it kind of drags, your musculature around on the top of your skull. That's all actually like fascia. Here you can see, right, there are definitely more fascial areas, and fascia tends to tighten up very similarly to your tendons, right? Because it is connective tissue that doesn't get as much blood flow. It doesn't repair quite as easily. It has a hard time kind of keeping up with your muscles. So we're actually kind of seeing that here, right? Like we can see all these areas where, every one of these muscles is going to attach via a tendon. But some of them have like these kind of wider areas where there's more of a tendon than others. And you'll notice these are the areas where you'll hear of a lot of common injuries. Take a look right here on the lateral side of the elbow, right? That's tennis elbow, right? And it's where you get tendonitis, where essentially like all of this soft tissue starts rubbing on this little knob here on the side of your elbow. Well, guess what? There's also golfer's elbow, which is rubbing on this knob. And you can actually see that right here where this would rub, right? We can see carpal tunnel syndrome, although that's not necessarily like a fascial problem. It's more like a where this like big long tendon here, you see, like, runs all the way down and then it kind of becomes your fingers and stuff. This little connective tissue band basically gets really tight, and that's sort of what causes carpal tunnel. It's a little bit different there, but it is caused by tight connective tissue. There's a lot in your low back. You can see these areas here. And then here's like a big one that's a constant problem for a lot of people. You can see this white area right here on the side of the thigh. That is your iliotibial band, or your IT band, which is very much mostly fascia and does like to tighten up. And then that rubs on the side of the knee here. Sometimes it'll rub on the side of the hip right here. So we like fascia because it's really good at like making sure that our body is sort of arranged the way it's supposed to do. But it does tend to get really tight very easily and start to rub, which is one of the reasons why we need to spend so much time talking about posture. I know that like I sound like a broken record so often, where people are like, I got this problem, and I'm like, posture. And they're like, yeah, I know, but I do this. I'm like, posture. Like posture really is like a very important deal, because it is what is ensuring that like our soft tissue, like connective tissue or like a muscle, isn't rubbing against our hard tissue like our bones. Because when that rubbing happens, it literally, imagine this right now. Actually, really quick, a class survey. Has anybody in here ever had IT band syndrome? Anybody have runner's hip or runner's knee? Anybody ever have that before?
Me a little bit. I have some inflammation
Yeah, a little bit. Side of the knee or side of the hip?
in the knee. Yeah.
In the knee. All right. So Kenny, your stretch for that, by the way, is right here. I would say do your TFL stretch. Remember, that's the one where you're standing. But also, oh, come on, give me the one I want. I mean, all these are actually fine. There we go. This stretch right here. Take a strap and take a band and cross it over, and it will stretch the outside of your thigh right there. I find that one's very, very convenient. There is also this one. I don't like this one quite as much because it kind of tightens up the low back, but it can work. And then there is the classic like TFL stretch as well. That one where you're in a standing position. All right, come on. There it is. You're in a standing position with one leg back, and you kind of lean over to the side. Both those stretches are really good. If you keep having that problem, Kenny, that can have a really positive impact. But yeah, what that rubbing sensation on the side of your knee is where, this connective tissue right here, or this connective tissue is rubbing along the inside, the outside of your patella there, right? It's rubbing on your thigh bone. So again, posture is really important to make sure that our fascia doesn't sort of get overworked. Because imagine it like this, like take your hands, guys, put them together and start rubbing. And now don't stop for the next 8 hours. right? Your like, your hands are going to explode, right? It's going to just create more and more and more friction and more heat. And that's sort of what we're seeing in tendonitis or, fasciitis problems like plantar fasciitis or palmar fasciitis. That's what we're seeing there. And it is all tied directly to our posture, which is what this course is all about. We're looking at, analyzing human posture. So understanding our connective tissue, especially our tendons. Tendons are the type of connective tissue. All of your muscles end in a tendon, like I said, right? Every muscle you've got is going to attach, thanks to having like a tendon at the very end that will sort of insert onto a bone, and it just doesn't get as much blood flow. It just doesn't repair as quickly. There's not as many capillaries in your connective tissue. So because of that, honestly, when you hear about somebody pulling a muscle, it is very rarely the muscle's fault. Your muscles get lots of blood flow. They're springy. They're flexible. They're soft. They're squishy. Muscles are great at stretching and they're great at like contracting. So it's actually pretty rare that a tear in a muscle is actually the muscle's fault. A lot of times it's where your connective tissue, such as your tendon, is worried about maintaining its grip on a bone. So what it'll do is it'll just tighten up like crazy. And then all of a sudden your muscle loses all of its mobility and something's got to give. So rather than like that really tight connective tissue giving, your muscle sort of experiences some type of tear. Unless it's like a really severe tear. If you ever see like a tendon tear, those are brutal, because like if you get like a full on tendon tear, oh gosh, the muscle basically like rolls up. Whatever you do, do not look that up on YouTube. But yeah, tendon tears are absolutely brutal. So that's what we've got in terms of like our overall connective tissue and our overall structure of our muscles. Anybody have any questions on any of that? Questions, comments, concerns so far? Everybody feeling good? All righty. So let's get a little bit more internal. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit. And we're going to kind of go in from, sort of this outer area. And we're going to zoom in and take a look at an individual muscle cell, right? So let's take a look at like a muscle fiber, what we're seeing right here, right? An individual muscle cell. So if we're looking at a muscle cell or a muscle fiber, as we like to call them, like I said, it's going to have all of the normal key players that you see in muscles, right? We're going to see all the normal anatomy, or I'm sorry, not in muscles, in cells, right? We're going to see, if I look up like just a classic sort of animal cell, right? This is sort of just your classic generic animal cell. And no cell in your body actually looks like this, except for maybe it's really close to a fat cell, but other than that, your cells don't actually ever look like sort of a base animal cell. But this chart kind of represents, the characteristics that all of our cells kind of share, So you're going to see like a big nucleus in the center and a nucleolus and lysosomes, which are basically the cell's immune system. You can see like a membrane around the outside. You can see these little Golgi bodies, ribosomes, which are in charge of assembling proteins. So when the cell wants to grow, and the nucleus is basically going to tell the ribosomes how to build new stuff, and then these big guys right here, these mitochondria, these little they look like pill bugs. These mitochondria are where we're actually producing our energy. And then we're seeing right here, all of this area, this whole area within this cell, is a very wet, soupy, swampy area. All of your cells are very fluid. This is why like humans are 80% water. Most of our cells are, this fluid. And we have a special name for it. We call it the cytoplasm. You can think of it as like cell water, right? Cell fluid. And so your cytoplasm within your cells is great because like you can actually produce energy in that cytoplasm. You can actually produce, if you were to take in like a sugar and it ferments, it's actually going to release some energy inside of there. But also it's going to create some byproducts in the form of lactic acid. And luckily that'll go into the mitochondria and then we produce even more energy. But we're not going to talk about that today. But basically you've got, this kind of wet, soupy area. So the first thing we're going to kind of see inside of a muscle cell is we are going to see that it has that classic cytoplasm. It has its cellular plasma. However, we do actually kind of give it a special name here. We're going to call it your sarcoplasm. So again, anytime you see the prefix myo, you're talking about muscles. Anytime you see the prefix sarco, you're also pretty much talking about muscles, but sarco means flesh. So you've got like myo, which means muscle, and sarco, which means flesh. Both of those, I believe, in Latin, because, scientists loved to be fancy back in the day and named everything in Latin. So, so we've got our sarcoplasm here instead of calling it cytoplasm. And the reason it gets a special name is because it's got the liquid in it just like anything else, but it has some special materials that muscles need more than most of your other cells. There's going to be a lot of glycogen in there. Glycogen is basically a liquid storage form of carbohydrates. So we are actually pretty good at like glycogen. We're actually pretty good at storing these big, long, look at this complicated chain of sugar molecules, right? And we were able to actually store all those little sugar molecules as this sort of wet, soupy mixture within our muscle cells. So we don't really have like, I can't really have you can't go out and buy glycogen or anything like that. But if you were to like, when you're boiling like a pot of potatoes, and like, you maybe even boil them for a little while, and then there's that kind of scum that kind of like comes to the top. You get that like potato scum that's like the bubbles and the foamy stuff that's on top. That is actually all of the individual like little little sugar molecules that, because of the extreme heat and the agitation of the water, they're basically kind of flying off of your potatoes, and then they link together, and they all come together, and you get this kind of liquid carbohydrate scum on the top of your pot of boiling potatoes. That's actually what glycogen looks like. That's glycogen inside of your muscle cells. So that's why we call that cellular plasma. It's the liquid material within our cells that has like little sugar molecules in it, which is great because our muscles need lots of sugar in order to be able to produce lots and lots and lots of energy. So we're really grateful to have that. Now, inside of a muscle cell, you will also find mitochondria, just like you're going to find in any other type of cell, right? And so this little kind of interesting, I always think it looks like a potato bug, little organelle here is really good at producing energy, right? So again, we just talked about having like, sarcoplasm, which has some glycogen in it. And by the way, it has other things in it as well. It's got fats and minerals, vitamins like your B vitamin complex. It's also got myoglobin. Actually, I should talk about myoglobin. It does have myoglobin in it as well, which is a protein that carries oxygen around the muscle fiber cell. So if you need to get oxygen into the mitochondria, it's going to get a delivery thanks to your little protein myoglobin, which lives inside of your plasma as well. But the mitochondria, they're going to transform the energy from food into the energy that you can use to do work, right? So if you basically have a little bit of like glucose, right? So you have some of that sugar in there in that fluid, and then you add a little bit of oxygen, which is going to be delivered by that myoglobin. If both those things enter the mitochondria, your mitochondria is going to spit out a whole bunch of what we call ATP. And ATP is basically molecular currency. It's molecular energy. It's what allows us to do stuff. It's our cellular fuel, you know? And so we really love having mitochondria. And the more mitochondria you have, that can also contribute a little bit to hypertrophy. So there is room for like high repetition exercise in the realm of like muscular hypertrophy. Like I know a lot of times when we think of like, oh, high reps you use for endurance, low reps you use for like size, right? I know that's kind of a basic breakdown, but you do get a little bit of size from high repetition endurance because it draws more fluid into the cell, which puffs them up so you have more sarcoplasm, and it might result in more mitochondria, which means there's just more stuff within that cell. That cell is going to be bigger, you know. I had to move into I had to move out of its little studio apartment into a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. It's just a little bigger with more stuff in it, you know. So that is going to be your mitochondria. You're also going to see a nucleus inside of there, right? This is sort of the command center of everything. Your nucleus is sort of what controls your cell and tells your cell how to grow and do all the things that it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to function. And that nucleus, like I said, it's going to be found in every, kind of classic animal cell. It tells all of our cells how to grow. You'll even see that in plant cells. I mean, plant cells have nucleuses as well. But the big one that we're going to probably spend most of our time on are myofibrils. So we talked earlier about myofibrils, right? They're those little rods that kind of run end to end within our muscle cell. So if we look at like a myofibril, it is a specialized structure that contain a muscle fiber's myofilaments and allows the muscle to have the ability to contract and relax. So a myofibril is this big rod with all these proteins on it. And those proteins are called myofilaments. So we're going to break down what those myofilaments are and how they work. So looking at a myofilament, if we look at this here, actually, that's a really great, very zoomed in picture. I'm going to keep that one. Whoops. I'm going to keep that one to open in just a minute. But we'll come to that in just a sec here. Looking for the best picture I can find. There we go. Okay. So here's a really, really, really zoomed in picture of a myofilament. And you can see like there's all these little heads that live here. And then there's all these little circles here. Those are all little binding sites. And so these heads want to reach up and grab these binding sites. Now, zooming out, what that actually looks like, it actually kind of looks something more like this. Oh, come on. You know you want to be higher res than that. Okay, there we go. No black background. Yes. All right, so it kind of looks like this, right? This would be like what a myofibril looks like. It is this big, long strand of all of these little proteins tied together. These proteins are your myofilaments. So giving a little intro, you can kind of see we've got a picture of that here. I just think it's a little bit too small. So we can see if we're going to label these myofilaments, if we're going to understand what these little proteins are. The first one is going to be called your actin. And actin as a protein is basically this little thin strand right here, right? Remember I mentioned it has all those little binding sites. So these thin strands are little actin bands, right? And so here's like a little actin filament, three little actin filaments right here, right? And so that's the really thin strand. And like I said, if you look at it, it's got all these little binding sites, right? These little binding sites where, these proteins here want to reach up and grab these little, balls, right? And so the thin filament, actin, has binding sites on it. And the thick filament, which is called myosin, that's this filament here in the center with this kind of like, it kind of looks like a yucca plant. I didn't look this up last time. It kind of looks like a yucca tree. If you look at the top of it there, yucca flower. Come on, I don't want to spend all day on this. There we go. Right, it kind of branches out from, this, it kind of, that's kind of what I think myosin sort of looks like, right? And so you can see myosin's got all these little like branches here. And what happens is, if you actually look at it, you can kind of see it in this picture here. But there's sort of like two sides to the myosin heads. And they basically want to like reach up and they're like, or they kind of want to like grab those binding sites. And so it kind of splits its mouth open like this and grabs. So when that happens, right, they are now like bound together. And so that's what is basically wanting to happen all the time. These myosin proteins really want to bind to the binding sites on the actin proteins, okay? So the thin filament is actin, the thick filament is myosin. So actin has binding sites for your other myofilaments to attach to, and myosin has binding heads that reach up and attach to the actin, pulling the actin away from what we call its Z line. So what's going to happen is, if we take a look here, right, if this head reaches up and grabs one of these little bulbs, and then this one and this one, they all do that, what's going to happen is it's going to pull towards its center this way. So it's actually the head's going to reach up and grab, and it's going to kind of pull it over. And then it's able to let go, reach up and grab a little bit further up the band and pull again. And so it's kind of pulling, if you think about like how your muscle contractions work, it's kind of like pulling hand over fist, right? Like this protein reaches up and it pulls it this way, which allows this protein to reach up and pull this way. And then the next one's able to reach up and pull, right? And so that's going to happen in all of these proteins simultaneously. And so this actin filament here, here, and here, they're all going to get drawn towards the center, this direction here, towards this little blue dotted line. And then this side, the exact same thing's happening. They're pulling towards the blue dotted line. So now what's happening is your entire myofilament, your entire myofibril, which is the big rod, it houses all these proteins. The proteins are moving. So it draws that rod in a little bit closer to its center until eventually it looks something kind of like this, where it's contracted and it reaches the very end of the myosin strip there. And so now this is a fully contracted muscle. And that dragged this line right here and this line right here closer to the center, right? Those lines are called Z lines, by the way. And basically, let's see, Z line. Let's see if I can get a picture of that. Basically, you have a whole bunch of Z lines, leading up the entire myofibril. Yeah, that works. I mean, this is a very zoomed in picture, but you can see like, here's where actin and myosin are kind of crossing over one another. And so then there's the same thing happening on the other side, and they straddle each other. So you can see like they're just slightly offset. Like this one lines up with sort of like the middle here, and like this one lines up with the middle here. So because they're not like perfectly arranged like this, they're just slightly offset. That allows them, it creates this little zigzaggy motion. That's why we call this the Z line. So if you contract towards the center here and you contract towards the center here, this Z line is going to move closer to this one. Meanwhile, if the same thing happens on this side and this side, right? All of those myofibrils are all being shortened because the myofilaments are all drawing their Z lines closer together. Actually, you can kind of see there, right? Like see how they're straddled compared to one another. So this Z line will get shorter, the next one will get shorter, and the entire myofibril gets shorter. So that area where this happens, the area that we're sort of looking at a picture of here, right? We call this area the sarcomere. And this is what makes your muscles work. So I kind of pulled this picture up here. You can see there's like that little club-like head. It's got two different fibers, right? It wants to reach up and grab these binding sites. The area where this is happening, this area right between these two Z lines, is called the sarcomere. And you will hear this sentence in your textbook, they will say the sarcomere is the functional unit of the muscular system. And what they mean by that is the way that your muscles work is by shortening its sarcomeres. It is going to contract the myosin heads that are going to drag the actin filaments a little bit closer towards its center. So when those Z lines shorten, you are shortening a sarcomere. Now, here's the thing. Your body wants to be doing this always. These proteins are super attracted to one another. These proteins are absolutely crazy attracted to one another. And so because of that, if they had their way, they would basically bind together and never let go. So that wouldn't be very good, because then like we would make a muscle contraction and it would just be stuck that way for the rest of our life. So how the heck are we able to, stop these contractions from happening? Well, luckily, you have some regulatory proteins that live on the actin strand that can block their binding sites and keep your muscle from doing its contraction. Those proteins are going to be called troponin and tropomyosin. They live on the actin strand, and they're responsible for blocking myosin's ability to grab actin. If you think of like, there's a little bit of an inappropriate analogy, but if you think of like actin and myosin as like horny teenagers, troponin and tropomyosin are the chaperones that are like, hey, 6 inches, like they're in there like pushing them apart, making sure that like you are able to relax your muscle back to its normal length. And we can actually see that right here. You can see here's this like little green strand that's actually blocking the binding sites. Okay, that is your tropomyosin. But then you've also got these little troponin proteins that live, they're attached to the band, right? They're attached to the tropomyosin, right? And so when troponin moves away and that drags this strand off, that's when all of a sudden the binding sites are exposed. And so myosin and actin are like, it is on. And myosin reaches up, grabs actin, and pulls it towards the center. Then when your muscle contraction is over, it is going to relax, and that'll put those regulatory proteins back in place in order for relaxation to occur. So this is what allows our, troponin and tropomyosin are what allow our muscles to relax back to full length. Again, actin is the thin strand, which has binding sites. Myosin is the thick strand that wants to grab those binding sites. Troponin and tropomyosin are there to make sure that that doesn't happen when it's not supposed to. Without a signal from the nervous system to trigger a muscular contraction, troponin and tropomyosin will remain in place and keep those binding sites blocked until a signal from the nervous system says, all right, let's do this, right? And then all of a sudden, a muscle contraction actually occurs. So those are the two proteins that are blocking it. Like I said, tropomyosin lives on the actin filament. Troponin lives on the tropomyosin, and its job is to bind to, and we're going to look at it, it'll be calcium actually. And then, like I said, sarcomere, really important term here. This is the area between two Z lines. This is the area where actin and myosin are crossing over one another, right? And so the area there, that's the thing, like until now, these are all kind of like tangible, objective things that you can hold, like it's a protein, right? It's like it's a structure. The sarcomere is not necessarily a structure. It's like an area. It's an area of town almost, it's the area within your muscle cell. All right, quick little break here. Questions, questions, comments, concerns. Anybody have any questions about those proteins or how they work? Nobody?
I'm good.
All righty. So let's take a look here at some neural activation. So like I said, all of this is under the control of your nervous system, right? Like you've got motor neurons, which are going to, cause your muscle fibers to contract. Motor neurons are going to be responsible for creating these contractions. And so when we're looking at this and we look at like what neural activation is, it is how we're going to have communication between the nervous and the muscular systems, right? So they're going to do this through what we call motor units. Okay. So a motor unit, you can see here is, this is like one of your individual like spinal discs. And then what we're seeing is like a nerve cell sort of branch out, right? Your peripheral nervous system is going to branch out, and eventually it's going to have a motor neuron that attaches to like a muscle spindle to, receive or send information, right? So you can kind of see here, you've got, one on one side, and then you've got more fibers on the other side that are attached to the exact opposite antagonist muscle, right? So, let's say like your muscle spindle, and actually, I guess this isn't a motor neuron. This would be like a sensory neuron. The green one would be your motor neurons. The orange one is, I guess it's saying afferent. It's a sensory neuron. So when we look at like this muscle spindle here, right, which is, again, it's that sensory receptor we talked about yesterday. Muscle spindles sense the length of a muscle and the rate of length changes. So if you were to change the length of this muscle super, super rapidly, like if you were to just like jerk your arm open like that, right? What's going to happen is that muscle spindle might be really sensitive to that, and it might freak out. So what it'll do is it'll say, whoa, way too long, way too fast, right? And so it's afraid of tearing. So that sensory neuron is going to send information into your nervous system. Okay. So then it'll go up to your brain. Your brain will say, oh, wow, yeah. If we go that fast, this muscle might tear. So what we should do is we should contract that muscle in order to, shorten it so that it's no longer like stretched out to full length. We should shorten the muscle. So then it'll send a signal back through motor neurons, which will contract the bicep muscle. And that will trigger that sliding action that we talked about earlier, where the actin and the myosin bind together and the Z line sort of draws closer towards its center, right? So that is sort of what we look at in neural activation. So this process is happening thanks to what we call a motor unit, right? So what a motor unit is it's a single motor neuron, right? This little green wire right here, and all of the individual muscle fibers, all the individual muscle cells that it stimulates, right? And so when we look at this, if we look at like a motor unit, you'll see this is kind of a rudimentary drawing, but it actually works really well. You can see like here's an individual nerve cell, and this would be a motor neuron, and then it would travel down, and then there's this little wire that attaches to this one and this one and this one and this one, right? There is an individual sort of wire that attaches to each. So one neuron can actually control very, very, very many muscle fibers. In fact, you have big motor units and small motor units. The motor units inside of your eyes, for instance, you've only got like 10 or 20 muscle fibers for every single neuron that's like attached to it. So that's actually not that many, but if you look at like your gluteus maximus, which has hundreds of thousands of muscle cells, well, you might have like a single neuron that controls a couple thousand muscle fibers at once. And that's why that's such a big, strong muscle. So a motor unit, if we're looking at like how motor units are actually going to control everything, right? What's going to happen is your motor units are going to trigger your muscle contractions. And when I say like what a muscle contraction is, right? We are talking about this concept called the sliding filament model, or the sliding filament action. And it's basically talking about how sarcomeres will slide across one another. The actin and the myosin proteins will slide across one another from one side to the other. And so that muscle cell will shorten. Now, we're not actually going to go through all of the steps of neural activation today. That's not really the focus of this course in particular. Like I said, this course is much more focused around understanding the concepts related to movement. But I do want to give you a very brief rundown. So we kind of already talked about this just a little bit, right? We kind of talked about how muscle contractions actually work. Well, when you look at it, it's this sliding action, right? You can kind of see here, right? Look at all these Z lines, right? There's a lot of space here, and then they got drawn closer to their center. And so now there's very little space. This is a fully contracted muscle. This would be a fully contracted sarcomere, which would be tied to another fully contracted sarcomere, which means the entire myofibril is fully contracted. So when the myofibril is contracted, it draws the muscle cell into a shortened length. And then that happens in the muscle cell next to it and the one next to it next. So the whole thing shortens. That's what a motor unit is, right? A motor unit is lots of muscle cells all experiencing this sliding action simultaneously, right? So if we look at this, this is kind of what that actually looks like. Is this GIF not going to play? So it reaches up and grabs, and it gets a little bit further, and a little bit further, and a little bit further until eventually it gets, fully contracted. Ooh. Did somebody animate this all together? That would be great. Nobody ever does it. Yeah, of course not. Nobody ever does it in like lots of oh, there we go. That's like too much to draw. There we go, right? We can see the entire Z line sort of drawing together. I like this because you can actually see two separate Z lines rather than seeing just one sarcomere. So that is sort of how this contraction, oh, wow. No way. That's so funny. Wow, look at that. Yeah, now you can see, look at how many, millions and millions. That's pretty freaking cool. So when that occurs, right, like I said, that is going to shorten your muscles. Your muscle is going to go from being a normal resting length to a shortened position. So the way that this happens, the way your nervous system sort of interacts with your muscular system, because these are two very different types of tissues, it is going to use electrochemical signals that coordinate these contractions to occur, right? And so again, this is what we call the sliding filament model or the sliding filament theory. And basically, it's the idea that a sarcomere will shorten because the Z lines are moving closer together. And what is happening, and it's all described in this big, long, crazy, complicated slide here. But what is going to happen is your nervous system, is actually going to interact with your muscular system like this. You'll see an electric signal will travel down a neuron. And then once it gets to the very end of that neuron, it will release these chemicals, which you're kind of seeing like kind of passively sitting in the area right now. But those chemicals would live in these little sacs and then they would get released. And those chemicals are called acetylcholine. And acetylcholine will bind to these receptor sites on the muscle cell. And when that happens is the muscle cell will then create its own electrochemical signal. Come on, give me a picture of that. Load. I feel like I've actually seen this one before. Oh. Is my internet just suck today, or are these not actually GIFs? Oh my God. Always hard to freaking Google stuff like this. So what's going to basically happen is this electrochemical signal will travel down, and it will, like I said, it will release these chemicals here. And when they bind to these receptor sites, what happens is electricity will then run throughout the muscle. So then the muscle will create its own electric charge. And when that happens and it runs across the entire muscle fiber, what it will do is it will actually release calcium into the sarcomere. And so when that happens, and you can actually see it here, these little tiny dots, calcium moves in, okay? And calcium is what, you remember that actin and myosin are really attracted to one another, right? Like actin and myosin are super attracted. Myosin wants to reach up and grab actin all the time, but it can't because the chaperones, troponin and tropomyosin, they're in the way, right? They are blocking and keeping that from happening. Well, how the heck do you get those chaperones out of the way? You buy them off. You basically bribe them with a little bit of calcium. And that's what we're seeing here. These little dots, those are actually little calcium ions. And so when they move in, the binding sites lift up and grab the calcium ions, right? Basically, what really happens is troponin, which again is living on the tropomyosin, binds to the calcium, and then it lifts that band up, which is what we're seeing here, right? This isn't bad. This is kind of an okay GIF. Is this even better? That's great. All right, so we see calcium. Yeah, calcium reaches up and it gets bound. It grabs that band and exposes the binding sites, and then myosin reaches up and grabs actin. That's what actually allows that signal to occur. So when we look at like this very complicated process, right? What is happening is your nervous system, your nerve cell, your motor neuron will release an electrochemical signal, which will travel down the neuron. And then once it gets to the very end, it will release this chemical called ACH, or acetylcholine. Acetylcholine will move across this little gap. It'll grab the muscle fiber, and then that will trigger an electric signal that runs across the muscle fiber. And when that electric signal runs across the muscle fiber, calcium, which it has been storing up, is released into the area. When that calcium is in the area, the chaperones are like, oh my gosh, I got to get some of that calcium. So they reach up and grab it, which drags the binding blockers, right? The sort of like protein that's in the way, keeping this binding from happening. It moves out of the way. And then that allows myosin to reach up and grab actin and pull it into a shortened position. Then once that electric signal is over, calcium is flushed out of the area. The chaperones move back in place. They're like, get apart, right? And then that actually causes myosin to go back into its resting position and get ready for the next contraction. So every muscle contraction you make, every single movement that you take, all of this happens every single time. It's a very, very sort of complex process with lots of little tiny moving parts. Do we have any questions on that? Lorianne, how you feeling? This is only your day 2.
Yeah, had I not had any previous education, I might have been bald.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, you got the nursing classes, right?
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, so like I said, we didn't have to put any of that in our notes. I like to mention it. It's actually not going to be something you're tested on in this class in particular, but it comes up later. So I always like to at least bring it up as a refresher. But luckily, no notes today on that. All right, let's take a look. Let's zoom out, shall we? Let's stop being all cellular biology about it, and let's get into a little bit more of the fun stuff. So I want to show you guys kind of a fun little video here. This video is actually about the different types of hypertrophy. There we go. That's not the one I want. Is it the one I want? Sorry, let me click this for just one second.
What if one piece of equipment could change everything about how you work out? Meet the mirror.
Hey, what's up, guys? Matt with the Movement System. In this video, what's going on here? So,
This is the one I want. Okay. Whoops. All right. Okay. So a little 5-minute video here. This is going to talk about like how muscular growth works, right? So when we're growing our muscles, they are going to grow in sort of two different ways. They have two sort of different characteristics. This video is not necessarily going to break those down yet, but understanding how muscles grow first is going to help us understand that in just a minute. So here we go.
Hey, what's up, guys? Matt with the Movement System.
Oh, wait, I got to share the sound. Share sound.
In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and myofibrillar hypertrophy. And we're going to talk about specific training variables and some myths that are surrounding this topic. Let's go ahead and dive into it. Okay, so to lay the groundwork, muscle is composed of about 70% myofibrillar proteins, 20% sarcoplasmic proteins, and 10% mitochondrial proteins. Theoretically, I can shift this ratio. So I'm just using that 70% to 20% as a pretty rough estimate for the average population. But let's just say that theoretically, I can increase the sarcoplasmic proteins a little bit more than I can increase the myofibrillar proteins based on training decisions. Okay, so now knowing some numbers as a baseline, let's move into the theory a little bit and actually discuss what's going on here. So we know that bodybuilders produce less force with the same cross-sectional area of muscle than powerlifters do. This is actually really well documented in research, and we can see that bodybuilders produce about 2/3 the amount of force as a powerlifter at the same size. So at this point you may be thinking, okay, well then the powerlifter obviously has more myofibrillar proteins because those are our contractile proteins. Those are the actin and myosin that are actually producing the force, whereas the sarcoplasmic proteins are expanding cell volume without necessarily increased force production. That's the theory. But here's one missing piece, and that is the neuromuscular adaptation. So we know that powerlifters train with very heavy loads and with high force activities. So on the force velocity curve, they're very far up at the top on the force end in terms of their training. So this really does need to be considered when we're looking at the difference in force output of bodybuilders and powerlifters. And based on my research, this is actually the more significant role is the neuromuscular adaptation than the difference in myofibrillar versus sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Now both of these should work in combination, meaning that if a bodybuilder is specifically concerned about size, they're not going to necessarily do high force training, and they're not necessarily going to be worried about maximal loads on the bar. Rather, they're going to be thinking about volume and the potentially higher testosterone response from higher volume training and things like that. Whereas a powerlifter who's most concerned about their Wilks or their weight to strength ratio, they need to actually be maximizing strength and force output at a minimal body weight. So that powerlifter is going to make strategic decisions in training to maximize force output for those neuromuscular adaptations and potentially get a little bit more myofibrillar hypertrophy from that type of training as well. So I don't think that these are necessarily independent and you could focus on one or the other, but it kind of goes hand in hand that when you're doing that high force training, you are also doing the type of training that may stimulate a little bit more on the myofibrillar hypertrophy side. Thinking back to the bodybuilder, we also have to consider the energy system, and bodybuilders using that 8, 10, 12, 15 reps range are going to be typically using a little bit more of that anaerobic glycolysis pathway. They're going to be causing more local metabolic acidosis, potentially relying a little bit more on the cardiovascular pathways, the capillaries into the muscle, and needing more of those sarcoplasmic and mitochondrial protein to be building and increasing in order to actually facilitate the type of training they're doing. So doing that type of training, they actually may be prioritizing that 30%, that sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and mitochondrial protein growth just by the type of training that they're doing. So because of the relationship between anaerobic metabolism and sarcoplasmic proteins, there probably is some preferential sarcoplasmic hypertrophy for that higher rep bodybuilder style training. To what extent, we really don't know, and there needs to probably be more research to actually clarify the extent to which those sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophies can be prioritized, but that probably does occur to some extent. It's not the entire mechanism that is causing the difference between bodybuilders and powerlifters in terms of force output. A lot of that is neurophysiological in the actual strength of the neurons, the motor neurons that are going from the brain down to the muscles. But in combination, those two things are in fact resulting in that difference in the force output of a bodybuilder being about 2/3 the force output of an equally sized powerlifter. All right, guys, so that's the science. I hope that helps you understand and make training decisions. If this has been helpful for you, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe for more videos like this. I'll definitely be doing follow-ups as more research comes out, and I will link some articles in the description of this video for you to read more about. Thanks, guys, and we'll catch you in the next one.
All right. So that's kind of the thing about like muscle growth, right? They have like, they're going to grow with different characteristics depending on the type of training that you give your client. Again, if we go back to the idea of like assessing our clients, which is, you know, our focus for the next 12 days. If we're talking about like understanding, you know, assessments, part of that is asking your client like what their goals are. And if they say they want to get really big, well, that's going to be very different than a client who says they want to get really strong. And that's also going to be really different than a client who says, hey, I want to just burn as many calories as possible because I'm maybe trying to drop a few pounds, right? So different types of stress that we put on the body are going to result in different types of growth, you know? So when we look at like our muscle fiber types, and we look at sort of these biologic characteristics, your muscles are going to have these different characteristics that allow them to have different like strength, energy levels, and obviously like, you know, visual differences, right? So there's two major categories, and then there's the sort of a subcategory here. So we're going to see the first category are our type 1 muscle fibers. You guys are mostly using your type 1 muscle fibers like right about now. Type 1 muscle fibers are basically your high endurance fibers. So the muscle fibers that are like kind of keeping you upright right now. You know, the core muscles that are maybe doing a little bit of work, but they're not necessarily like, you know, getting fatigued or anything like that. The reason they're not experiencing fatigue is because they are slow twitch muscle fibers. They're type 1 fibers that have a lot of like blood flow. They have increased blood flow. They have increased capillaries, which means, you know, it's easier for them to get that blood flow. They have more myoglobin in them, which is that protein that carries oxygen. And remember, oxygen is how we produce energy. They have more mitochondria in them. So because they have more mitochondria and more oxygen delivery, they're definitely going to be more associated with like stabilizing and endurance type lifting. Okay. But the other thing is, because they are so good at like converting lactic acid into energy, because of all the mitochondria, they don't really experience a lot of inflammation the same way that our type 2 muscle fibers do. So due to that lack of inflammation throughout their, you know, growth over the course of your entire life, they're much smaller in size, and they don't have as many myofibrillar proteins inside of them, which means they're also going to produce less force. So your type 1 muscle fibers are your smaller, more endurance-based muscle fibers that do produce like a little bit of force, are much less force. Now, don't forget, just because like they're type 1 fibers, it doesn't mean they can't experience like, you know, strength and like size gains. They can absolutely grow the same way other fibers can. It's just that their capacity for that growth is much smaller. You know, like if I had $100 and I increased it by, let's say 10%, I'd have $110, right? But which is a $10 increase. But if I had like, you know, $500 and I increased it by 10%, I'd have $50 extra, 5 times as much as I had before. Because it was much small, you know, one was much smaller when it started. 10% growth is very different than something that was much larger when it grew by 10%, right? So that's why like type 1 fibers actually absolutely can experience like hypertrophic growth. They can absolutely experience like myofibrillar growth and like they get stronger. but they are definitely our muscle fibers that are much more associated with stabilization and endurance type activities. Okay. Your core are very much type 1 muscle fibers. Your soleus, right? It's walking you around all day. You know, you're getting your 10,000 steps in, right? Like that's very much a slow twitch endurance type fiber. But then we've got sort of the ones that most of our bodybuilders are focused on, the ones our clients are kind of paying us for, making larger. And those are your type 2 muscle fibers. So these are your fast twitch muscle fibers. Okay. You get slow twitch, type 1. Type 2 is fast twitch. And so these are going to be much larger in size. And they're very, very good at producing way more force. Typically, we think of our type 2 muscle fibers as being associated with max strength and power type contractions. But the problem here, they don't have as much blood flow as our type 1 fibers. They don't have as much mitochondria as our type 1 fibers. So they're not able to produce energy on the go as easily. So these are muscle fibers that are pretty quick to fatigue. However, they do have, in some cases, more cytoplasm inside of the fiber and less mitochondria. So there's sort of two different types of fast twitch muscle fibers. We're going to see our type 2A, which are your high oxidative fast twitch muscle fibers. You can think of type 2A as sort of like type 1.5. Like they're kind of like, they are fast twitch fibers to be sure, but they also have a little bit of endurance, kind of similar to type 1 fibers. We typically associate type 2A fibers with bodybuilders or like professional athletes. People who have like a relatively goodly amount of endurance and are relatively like strong, but they're not as strong as like a full-on like power lifter. Like I'm sure, actually, you know what? This is kind of fun. I just saw a video of this, and let's see how long this is, and then we'll consider watching this because I saw this pop up on my feed recently. NFL player versus Olympic 100 sprinter. Okay, yeah. Here we go. This is going to be kind of fun.
Steve and Dave use eToro to trade crypto.
So here's Tyreek Hill, who is so very fast. Tyreek Hill is incredibly fast. And he's a professional athlete, right? He's an NFL player. But remember, you think about like what an NFL player does. He has to go over and over and over and over and over again, right? Like he has to do play after play after play after play. You think about an Olympic sprinter, their job is to sprint once and then they are done, right? So we're going to see the difference between these two types of athletes.
Are all bidding for a position to compete on the global stage. NFL superstar Tyreek Hill is one of those men. Just before going to win the Super Bowl with the Kansas City Chiefs, he made it clear that he would like to compete against the world's fastest men at the upcoming Olympic Games.
I really want to try to qualify for some Olympic teams, even go to pin relays.
There is no doubt that this 5-foot, 10-inch wide receiver has speed, but is he fast enough to compete against the world's elite?
He is very fast. I'm kind of curious to see if...
In his early years, Hill was a stellar sprinter, running 10.19 and 20.14 in high school. Besides, he ran wind-assisted 9.98 seconds. However, given the current strength of American sprinting, it takes more than talent to get on the U.S. Olympic team. As trivial as it seems, one should be a top world-class sprinter. Interestingly, Jahvid Best, former Lions cornerback, became the first NFL player to participate in the Summer Olympics. He avoided the U.S. Olympic trials by representing the tiny Caribbean island nation where his father was born. 27-year-old Jahvid Best was able to fulfill his Olympic dream by racing in the 100-meter heat with Usain Bolt. Unfortunately, trying too desperately to keep up with the fastest man on the planet, he lost too much ground as a result. Although Best's speed was never in question, he could not proceed in the next round, thus ending an eternal debate whether a football player can run faster than a professional sprinter. Tyreek Hill is the fastest NFL player. No one in the world can run as fast as Hill on a football field. However, sprinters don't have to wear pads and have people trying to tackle them. Success for a 100-meter sprinter comes from reaching and maintaining superior velocity on the track. Even though Hill can cover the first 40 meters as quickly as a world-class sprinter, the challenge for him doesn't lay in his start, but actually what comes after. While it is exciting to watch Hill racing up the field at super speed, nevertheless, elite sprinters can run up to 27 miles per hour, so Hill's highest ever recorded speed leaves him at the far end of the fastest athletes in the world.
So not quite, right? So when we think about this, I was really, really hoping to see him actually do a 100-meter dash. So when you think about it, like these are two very different types of athletes. Those are both very much fast twitch athletes, right? But when you consider like how explosive one person is versus like another, that's the difference between either low oxidative or high oxidative fibers, right? So a high oxidative fast twitch fiber person is typically what we associate with our professional athletes, right? Like we think about like LeBron is probably very strong, but he also plays a lot of minutes, right? Maybe not as many anymore, but like, definitely like a very, very active person, right? That's sort of what we associated with like general athletics. But then we have our type 2X muscle fibers, which are your low oxidative fast twitch fibers. These are your true fast twitch fibers. Like type 2X is like the most powerful, crazy type of fiber that is then immediately exhausted, right? When you think about like a power lifter, right? Or you think about like, the strong, like world's strongest man competitions, right? Their job is to do like one really big, powerful lift, take a barbell, get that freaking thing up overhead. And then that's the entire sport. They're done for the day, right? So when we think about like myofibrillar strength, we are very much seeing type 2X muscle fibers. Now, when we start thinking about like type 2A, we're seeing some myofibrillar for sure. But we're also seeing a lot of sarcoplasmic growth as well. And when we're seeing growth in type 1 muscle fibers, which is pretty limited because they don't get very large, this is usually due to the growth of things like more nuclei and more mitochondria, which only accounts for about 10% of your cellular volume. So if you take something that's only 10% of something else and you grow it by a little bit, it's not going to get that much larger. Myofibrillar growth, that accounts for about 70% of your cell volume. And that's why like that is going to get much, much, much larger when it grows by maybe 10%, right? And that's why you look at like the Game of Thrones, the mountain, you look at Hafthor Bjornsson, right? This guy is absolutely enormous. And he was the world's strongest man, right? That's a lot of myofibrillar growth. And then you've got your type 2A fibers, which are kind of in the middle, right? That's a lot of like, maybe there's some myofibrillar growth, but there's a lot of sarcoplasmic growth. So we have large cells that maybe do have like some endurance, but they're not as much endurance as type 1. So that's sort of like what we're seeing there. If you are trying to be an athlete, you're definitely going to put a lot of emphasis on developing your type 2A muscle fibers. You want to be strong, you want to be powerful, but you do still need to have a little bit of endurance if you're going to compete in like a competitive, on the field sport. If you're trying to be a power lifter, well, you're going to focus much more on, going for that maximal heavy lifting, style of training. And if you're trying to go for endurance, well, you're going to do very lightweight and lots of repetitions. Any questions on that, guys? All right. Feeling good. So we're in the home stretch here. So let's take a look here. The last concept we're going to look at today, we're going to look at how we sort of label muscles and sort of speak the language of human movement. So for those of you who have been through kinesiology, this is going to look very, very familiar. But looking at muscles as movers, we are going to label our muscles in relation to whatever it is they happen to be doing at the time, right? So we're going to look for, labeling our muscles based on like our perspective of what it is we're talking about. So if I'm talking about like doing a bicep curl, then we've got whatever muscle is mostly in charge of doing that bicep curl is going to be what we refer to as an agonist. So an agonist is a muscle that is acting as a prime mover. Now, I want to say this right up at the top. Any muscle in your body can either be an agonist or an antagonist or a synergist or a stabilizer. It depends on the movement that you are describing, okay? So if you're talking about doing a bicep curl, then the agonist is going to be your biceps brachii, right? If you are talking about doing a pull-up, then your agonist is going to be your latissimus dorsi. And now suddenly your bicep is just there to help. It's a synergist, okay? So agonist muscles are muscles that are acting as prime movers. If you think about like doing hip extension, like if you think about doing like a squat, right, which you can see is we're sitting into the bottom portion of a squat, right? She is in, ankle dorsiflexion, she's in knee flexion, and she's in hip flexion, right? If she's coming out of that squat, right, and standing up, well, then she's going to perform hip extension. So your gluteus maximus is the prime mover for hip extension. So when we think about like what the prime mover is, our agonist for, squatting actions, well, that agonist is definitely going to be our glute max. Now you also have an opposite muscle directly on the other side of the joint, which is there to sort of give tension in the opposite direction so that you don't just overly pull in one direction. It works exactly the opposite of your prime mover. So the exact opposite of an agonist is your antagonist. And this is a muscle that's acting in the opposite direction. So if your gluteus maximus does hip extension, then we need to look at whatever muscle does hip flexion, and that's going to be your hip flexor complex. So your hip flexors are the antagonists for hip extension. They do exactly the opposite thing. And so now you've got tension on both sides of the joint, which is good because we're not going to overly pull in one direction. Then you have got synergist muscles, and synergist muscles are there to help your prime movers. They're there to assist your agonist. Your hamstrings, for instance, also do a little bit of hip extension, but they're not great. They're mostly in charge of knee flexion. That's mostly what your hamstrings do. But they do assist just a little bit with hip extension. So your hamstrings are there to help during your squat, right? Meanwhile, we've got stabilizer muscles that are active in the rest of the body, or maybe in like, the joints that we're moving. And stabilizer muscles are there to stabilize the body during your functional movement patterns. They're things like your rotator cuff, for example. If I'm doing like a shoulder press, right, the main muscle I'm using is my deltoid, right? And then I'm getting a little bit of help from my pectoralis major. I'm getting a little bit of help from my triceps, right? But my rotator cuff is there to stabilize as I am moving up to make sure that I don't overly move in any one direction. It's there to create some tension in the area to stabilize the entire joint. The same thing is true of your core. If you're doing like a squat, your core is going to work to stabilize your spine during that movement pattern. Okay, so that is sort of how we label out our muscles. So you can think of agonist as like Batman in the story, it's like the main character of whatever it is you are talking about at the time. Again, if you're talking about a chest press, right, like a bench press maybe, your agonist, Batman in this scenario, is your pectoralis major. Then you have got synergist muscles, which are there to help, right? Synergists are going to assist your prime movers. So your triceps and your deltoid muscles, they're kind of like Robin in this situation. They're there to help Batman out, right? They're the sidekick. And they're going to assist in that movement. Meanwhile, you've got an antagonist like the Joker, who is exactly the opposite, working in the other direction. So your posterior deltoid, which pulls this way, right, is there to create like a little bit of tension. And then you've got stabilizer muscles, which are there to kind of hold the whole area in place and assist everybody, right? It's Alfred the Butler, right? So those are sort of the different parts of, you know, what we're looking at when we look at, you know, whatever type of movement we're talking about. So that's kind of the end of the notes section. I'm going to move through the endocrine system here just really quick, just so we can finish up chapter 2. But like I said, none of this is really going to be a big focus. You're not really assessing endocrine function. So we're not really going to spend too much time on hormones in this course, but it's just a couple slides here real quick. So I'm just going to knock these out. So your endocrine system, you know, is going to work. It's a control system kind of similar to your nervous system. But when you think about like your nervous system is, you know, actively controlling things in real time, your endocrine system is a little bit different. It sort of controls things just through like a series of like hormones and glands and things like that. So it's a little bit different, right? Like your nervous system is like a light switch. It turns something on and it turns something off. But your endocrine system is almost like gasoline. Like you light it and it's going to burn for a little while, right? So it's going to consist of host organs like your kidneys, your stomach, you know, and then it's got you know, specific glands that are going to secrete chemical messengers, and then those chemical messengers are going to bind to target cells within the body that trigger certain reactions, right? So target cells bind specifically to hormones, and those hormones are used to regulate certain body functions like growth. That's going to be controlled by things like testosterone or estrogen or human growth hormone. They can regulate your metabolism, such as like cortisol, which can slow how quickly your cells burn energy, or maybe it is adrenaline, which sort of speeds up how quickly your cells do things, or they respond to stress, like cortisol and adrenaline as well. So this is a sort of an example here. You can see the primary glands of your endocrine system. The main one that we're going to see is your pituitary gland. We sort of call this the master gland, and it lives at the very base of your brain. And again, remember, your brain and your nervous system are very interconnected. They're both control systems that, you know, tell your body to do stuff, right? It's just that the nervous system is sort of like I said, it's a kind of an on-off switch. A little bit easier to sort of get done. Hormone system, endocrine system tends to be a little bit more intense, but also a little bit slower to respond. So your pituitary gland is actually a gland that releases hormones, and this is what's kind of weird, that trigger other hormones. So it's like hormones that make hormones, you know. It's sort of like the hormone hotline if you think about it. And so your pituitary gland is also going to be attached to your hypothalamus, which is this bottom portion of your brain there. You're also going to see your thyroid gland. This is the one that sort of quickly regulates your metabolism. It releases what we call thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroid stimulating hormone is basically what is going to run through your body and tell your body to either speed things up or slow things down. And you'll also see like adrenal glands, and those live on top of your kidneys. Actually, they release adrenaline, which is, you know, this hormone that sort of like, you know, amps you up and you know, sometimes stresses you out. So like I said, the pituitary gland is the master gland. It's got all these different lobes on it, an anterior lobe, an intermediate lobe, and a posterior lobe. And they all secrete like different things, right? You can see the posterior lobe releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to be responsible for like fluid retention. It also releases like oxytocin, which is often referred to as the cuddle hormone. Oxytocin is also the hormone that triggers childbirth. So this is why like oftentimes they will sort of like inject oxytocin to stimulate childbirth. We'll also see like anterior lobes, right? Like you'll see ACTH and thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, a lot of different types of hormones running throughout the body. They're all going to result in different things. The big ones that we're going to talk about are like your thyroid gland, which is there to either speed your cells up or slow them down, your adrenal glands, which are producing things like adrenaline, which creates like your fight or flight response. So if we go back to talking about our nervous system from yesterday, right? You have your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Sympathetic freaks out, parasympathetic calms down. Well, if you're creating fight or flight hormones, that is under the control of your sympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system, which is autonomic and under the control of your peripheral nervous system, triggers this to happen. This is why sometimes you get stressed out and you can't really calm down. Because basically it's an autonomic function where you're producing these hormones that are kind of making you stressed, right? The only way to kind of fix that is to give it time and sort of, try to think calming and relaxing things so that you can activate the autonomic portion of your parasympathetic nervous system. You've also got like your testes and your adrenal glands, where you are producing things like adrenaline and testosterone. Testosterone, a very big hormone that is responsible for muscular growth. Much more common in men. We are going to see men produce about 10 times more testosterone than women do. This is why men have an easier time experiencing muscular growth and hypertrophy, right? Not that women don't, they absolutely can grow their muscles, but it is a lot more difficult to experience like type 2 muscular size style growth. One of the reasons why, if you're talking about training your female clients and they're worried about bulking up, they really don't have to worry about it. We've also got blood glucose control. We're going to control our glucose levels and regulate that by looking at the pancreas. Your pancreas is going to create two hormones. One is called insulin and the other one is called glucagon. Insulin is in charge of driving sugar out of your blood and storing it as either glycogen or fat. And then glucagon is responsible for breaking down glycogen if you have it stored up. So if you have glycogen stored up in your body, glucagon is going to trigger the release of that and break that down. Exercising regularly, which burns glucose as a fuel source, is a great way to regulate your insulin levels. Sometimes you'll be creating things that are called epinephrine. This is the big fancy way of saying adrenaline. Epinephrine, when it starts running through your body, again, adrenaline, increases your heart rate. It elevates your blood sugar levels by triggering the release of more glucagon. And it opens up your airways. It actually opens up the airways in your lungs to make it easier to drive bulk amounts of oxygen in. This is why when you think about like, if somebody ever gets like stung by a bee, they will take an EpiPen, which is a pen full of epinephrine. And so they'll inject that epinephrine in, and then that, if they're going into like anaphylaxis, where maybe their windpipe closes up, you inject them with epinephrine and their windpipe will open back up. And they'll be able to breathe again. They will also have a big energy boost because adrenaline is going to be running through the body like crazy. Like I said, hormones are sort of a control mechanism within the body. They're produced by both men and women. Women do produce testosterone. Men do produce estrogen. It's just that sort of the different sexes produce different levels of each of them. Both sexes are going to create cortisol, which is a stress hormone, very similar to adrenaline, but this is a very catabolic agent. Cortisol is a stress hormone that is there to sort of break stuff down in the body in response so that you don't have too many materials. Cortisol is a fat-building, muscle-burning hormone that we want to try to avoid at all costs, because if you're producing a lot of cortisol, it is much easier to produce massive amounts of body fat, and it is very difficult for you to maintain a good amount of body muscle. So we do need to be cautious with that. And then we've got our thyroid as well. This is going to be located in our neck. And like I said, your thyroid is going to regulate your metabolism. What's great is that exercise can elevate all of these things. We can get those muscle building properties from testosterone. We can get better at maintaining our blood glucose levels by, changing up how we use insulin. We can create more thyroid hormone, which speeds up our cells. All really positive stuff. Exercise has a positive benefit in, basically, your entire endocrine system, which kind of leads me to summarizing everything up. Exercise is a great way to train your nervous system, your muscular system, your skeletal system, and your endocrine system. So it's going to have very, very positive benefits to all of the things that regulate and control human movement, but also just kind of how we live our everyday lives. So if we're going to be able to apply this effectively, we need to be able to assess our clients, in all areas of their overall athleticism. And that's sort of what we are looking at over the rest of this class. And that is basically it today, guys. So today, your homework is to finish up reading chapter 2, which will really help you on your other homework, which is to do a 15-question quiz that is going to cover today's lecture as well as yesterday's. So Lorianne, I'm going to keep you on here for just a minute after class so I can walk you through how to do your homework. I know the rest of you guys have done this before, but I want to show you how to use Canvas and stuff just to make sure it's like super, super clear. But any questions before I kick you guys out of here?
It's all good, Brad. Thank you. Have a great day.
Cool, cool. All right. Have fun. Kick some butt on that homework. All right. Let's stop the recording here.